Chapter 4 of Anne of the Island. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 4. April's Lady. Kingsport is a quaint old town, harking back to early colonial days, and wrapped in its ancient atmosphere, as some fine old dame in garments fashioned like those of her youth. Here and there it sprouts out into modernity, but at heart it is still unspoiled. It is full of curious relics, and haloed by the romance of many legends of the past. Once it was a mere frontier station on the fringe of the wilderness, and those were the days when Indians kept life from being monotonous to the settlers. Then it grew to be a bone of contention between the British and the French, being occupied now by the one and now by the other, emerging from each occupation with some fresh scar of battling nations branded on it. It has in its park a Martello Tower, autographed all over by tourists, a dismantled old French fort on the hills beyond the town, and several antiquated cannon in its public squares. It has other historic spots also, which may be hunted out by the curious, and none is more quaint and delightful than Old St. John's Cemetery, at the very core of the town, with streets of quiet, old-time houses on two sides, and busy, bustling modern thoroughfares on the others. Every citizen of Kingsport feels a thrill of possessive pride in Old St. John's, for, if he be of any pretensions at all, he has an ancestor buried there, with a queer, crooked slab at his head, or else sprawling protectively over the grave, on which all the main facts of his history are recorded. For the most part, no great art or skill was lavished on those old tombstones. The larger number are of roughly chiselled brown or grey native stone, and only in a few cases is there any attempt at ornamentation. Some are adorned with skull and crossbones, and this grisly decoration is frequently coupled with a cherub's head. Many are prostrate and in ruins. In almost all, time's tooth has been gnawing, until some inscriptions have been completely effaced, and others can only be deciphered with difficulty. The graveyard is very full and very bowery, for it is surrounded and intersected by rows of elms and willows, beneath whose shade the sleepers must lie very dreamlessly, forever crooned to by the winds and leaves over them, and quite undisturbed by the clamour of traffic just beyond. Anne took the first of many rambles in Old St. John's the next afternoon. She and Priscilla had gone to Redmond in the forenoon and registered as students, after which there was nothing more to do that day. The girls gladly made their escape, for it was not exhilarating to be surrounded by crowds of strangers, most of whom had a rather alien appearance, as if not quite sure where they belonged. The freshettes stood about in detached groups of 2 or 3, looking askance at each other. The freshies, wiser in their day and generation, had banded themselves together on the big staircase of the entrance hall, where they were shouting out glees with all the vigour of youthful lungs, as a species of defiance to their traditional enemies, the Sophomores, a few of whom were prowling loftily about, looking properly disdainful of the unlicked cubs on the stairs. Gilbert and Charlie were nowhere to be seen.
"Little did I think the day would ever come when I'd be glad at the sight of a Sloane,"
said Priscilla as they crossed the campus.
"But I'd welcome Charlie's goggle eyes almost ecstatically. At least they'd be familiar eyes."
"Oh," sighed Anne, "I can't describe how I felt when I was standing there, waiting my turn to be registered, as insignificant as the teeniest drop in a most enormous bucket. It's bad enough to feel insignificant, but it's unbearable to have it grained into your soul that you will never, can never, be anything but insignificant, and that is how I did feel, as if I were invisible to the naked eye, and some of those Sophs might step on me. I knew I would go down to my grave unwept, unhonoured, and unsung."
"Wait till next year,"
comforted Priscilla.
"Then we'll be able to look as bored and sophisticated as any sophomore of them all. No doubt it is rather dreadful to feel insignificant, but I think it's better that than to feel as big and awkward as I did, as if I was sprawled all over Redmond. That's how I felt. I suppose because I was a good 2 inches taller than anyone else in the crowd. I wasn't afraid a Soph might walk all over me. I was afraid they'd take me for an elephant or an overgrown sample of a potato-fed islander."
"I suppose the trouble is we can't forgive Big Redmond for not being Little Queens," said Anne, gathering about her the shreds of her old cheerful philosophy to cover her nakedness of spirit. When we left Queen's we knew everybody and had a place of our own. I suppose we have been unconsciously expecting to take life up at Redmond just where we left off at Queen's, and now we feel as if the ground had slipped from under our feet. I'm thankful that neither Mrs. Lynde nor Mrs. Elisha Wright know, or ever will know, my state of mind at present. They would exult in saying I told you so, and be convinced it was the beginning of the end, whereas it is just the end of the beginning.
Exactly. That sounds more Annish. In a little while we'll be acclimated and acquainted, and all will be well. Anne, did you notice the girl who stood alone just outside the door of the co-ed's dressing-room all the morning? The pretty one with the brown eyes and the crooked mouth?
Yes, I did. I noticed her particularly, because she seemed the only creature there who looked as lonely and friendless as I felt. I had you, but she had no one.
I think she felt pretty all by herselfish too. Several times I saw her make a motion as if to cross over to us, but she never did it. Too shy, I suppose. I wish she would come. If I hadn't felt so much like the aforesaid elephant, I'd have gone to her. But I couldn't lumber across the big hall with all those boys howling on the stairs. She was the prettiest freshette I saw today, but probably favour is deceitful, and even beauty is vain on your first day at Redmond,"
concluded Priscilla with a laugh. "I'm going across to Old St. John's after lunch," said Anne. "I don't know that a graveyard is a very good place to go to get cheered up, but it seems the only get-at-able place where there are trees, and trees I must have. I'll sit on one of those old slabs and shut my eyes and imagine I'm in the Avonlea woods." Anne did not do that, however, for she found enough of interest in Old St. John's to keep her eyes wide open. They went in by the entrance gates, past the simple, massive stone arch surmounted by the great Lion of England. "And on Inkerman yet the wild bramble is gory, and those bleak heights henceforth shall be famous in story," quoted Anne, looking at it with a thrill. They found themselves in a dim, cool, green place where winds were fond of purring. Up and down the long grassy aisles they wandered, reading the quaint, voluminous epitaphs, carved in an age that had more leisure than our own. "Here lieth the body of Albert Crawford, Esquire," read Anne from a worn grey slab. "For many years keeper of His Majesty's ordnance at Kingsport. He served in the army till the peace of 1763, when he retired from bad health. He was a brave officer, the best of husbands, the best of fathers, the best of friends. He died October 29th, 1792, aged 84 years. There's an epitaph for you, Prissy. There is certainly some scope for imagination in it. How full such a life must have been of adventure! And as for his personal qualities, I'm sure human eulogy couldn't go further. I wonder if they told him he was all those best things while he was alive."
"Here's another,"
said Priscilla.
"Listen. To the memory of Alexander Ross, who died on the 22nd of September, 1840, aged 43 years. This is raised as a tribute of affection by one whom he served so faithfully for 27 years that he was regarded as a friend, deserving the fullest confidence and attachment."
"A very good epitaph," commented Anne thoughtfully. "I wouldn't wish a better. We are all servants of some sort, and if the fact that we are faithful can be truthfully inscribed on our tombstones, nothing more need be added. Here's a sorrowful little grey stone, Prissy. To the memory of a favourite child. And here is another, erected to the memory of one who is buried elsewhere. I wonder where that unknown grave is. Really, Pris, the graveyards of today will never be as interesting as this. You were right. I shall come here often. I love it already. I see we're not alone here. There's a girl down at the end of this avenue."
"Yes, and I believe it's the very girl we saw at Redmond this morning. I've been watching her for 5 minutes. She has started to come up the avenue exactly half a dozen times, and half a dozen times she has turned and gone back. Either she's dreadfully shy, or she has got something on her conscience. Let's go and meet her. It's easier to get acquainted in a graveyard than at Redmond, I believe."
They walked down the long grassy arcade towards the stranger, who was sitting on a grey slab under an enormous willow. She was certainly very pretty, with a vivid, irregular, bewitching type of prettiness. There was a gloss as of brown nuts on her satin-smooth hair, and a soft, ripe glow on her round cheeks. Her eyes were big and brown and velvety, under oddly pointed black brows, and her crooked mouth was rose-red. She wore a smart brown suit, with 2 very modish little shoes peeping from beneath it, and her hat of dull pink straw, wreathed with golden-brown poppies, had the indefinable, unmistakable air which pertains to the creation of an artist in millinery. Priscilla had a sudden stinging consciousness that her own hat had been trimmed by her village store milliner, and Anne wondered uncomfortably if the blouse she had made herself, and which Mrs. Lynde had fitted, looked very countrified and home-made beside the stranger's smart attire. For a moment both girls felt like turning back. But they had already stopped and turned towards the grey slab. It was too late to retreat, for the brown-eyed girl had evidently concluded that they were coming to speak to her. Instantly she sprang up, and came forward with outstretched hand, and a gay, friendly smile, in which there seemed not a shadow of either shyness or burdened conscience.
"Oh, I want to know who you two girls are,"
she exclaimed eagerly.
"I've been dying to know. I saw you at Redmond this morning. Say, wasn't it awful there? For the time I wished I had stayed home and got married."
Anne and Priscilla both broke into unconstrained laughter at this unexpected conclusion. The brown-eyed girl laughed too.
"I really did. I could have, you know. Come, let's all sit down on this gravestone and get acquainted. It won't be hard. I know we're going to adore each other. I knew it as soon as I saw you at Redmond this morning. I wanted so much to go right over and hug you both."
"Why didn't you?"
asked Priscilla.
"Because I simply couldn't make up my mind to do it. I never can make up my mind about anything myself. I'm always afflicted with indecision. Just as soon as I decide to do something, I feel in my bones that another course would be the correct one. It's a dreadful misfortune. But I was born that way, and there is no use in blaming me for it, as some people do. So I couldn't make up my mind to go and speak to you, much as I wanted to."
"We thought you were too shy," said Anne.
"No, no, dear. Shyness isn't among the many failings, or virtues, of Philippa Gordon. Phil, for short. Do call me Phil right off. Now, what are your handles?"
"She's Priscilla Grant," said Anne, pointing.
"And she's Anne Shirley,"
said Priscilla, pointing in turn. "And
we're
from the island," said both together.
"I hail from Bolingbroke, Nova Scotia,"
said Philippa. "Bolingbroke!" exclaimed Anne. "Why, that is where I was born."
"Do you really mean it? Why, that makes you a blue nose after all."
"No, it doesn't," retorted Anne. "Wasn't it Dan O'Connell who said that if a man was born in a stable it didn't make him a horse? I'm island to the core."
"Well, I'm glad you were born in Bolingbroke, anyway. It makes us kind of neighbors, doesn't it? And I like that, because when I tell you secrets, it won't be as if I were telling them to a stranger. I have to tell them. I can't keep secrets. It's no use to try. That's my worst failing. That and indecision, as aforesaid. Would you believe it? It took me half an hour to decide which hat to wear when I was coming here. Here, to a graveyard! At first I inclined to my brown one, with the feather, but as soon as I put it on, I thought this pink one with the floppy brim would be more becoming. When I got it pinned in place, I liked the brown one better. At last I put them close together on the bed, shut my eyes, and jabbed with a hat pin. The pin speared the pink one, so I put it on. It is becoming, isn't it? Tell me, what do you think of my looks?"
At this naive demand, made in a perfectly serious tone, Priscilla laughed again. But Anne said, impulsively squeezing Philippa's hand, "We thought this morning that you were the prettiest girl we saw at Redmond." Philippa's crooked mouth flashed into a bewitching crooked smile over very white little teeth.
"I thought that myself,"
was her next astounding statement.
"but I wanted someone else's opinion to bolster mine up. I can't decide even on my own appearance. Just as soon as I've decided that I'm pretty, I begin to feel miserably that I'm not. Besides, I have a horrible old great aunt who is always saying to me, with a mournful sigh, 'You were such a pretty baby. It's strange how children change when they grow up.' I adore aunts, but I detest great aunts. Please tell me quite often that I am pretty, if you don't mind. I feel so much more comfortable when I can believe I'm pretty. And I'll be just as obliging to you if you want me to. I can be, with a clear conscience."
"Thanks," laughed Anne. "But Priscilla and I are so firmly convinced of our own good looks that we don't need any assurance about them, so you needn't trouble."
"Oh, you're laughing at me. I know you think I'm abominably vain, but I'm not. There really isn't one spark of vanity in me. and I'm never a bit grudging about paying compliments to other girls, when they deserve them. I'm so glad I know you folks. I came up on Saturday, and I've nearly died of homesickness ever since. It's a horrible feeling, isn't it? In Bolingbroke I'm an important personage, and in Kingsport I'm just nobody. There were times when I could feel my soul turning a delicate blue. Where do you hang out?
38 St. John's Street.
Better and better. Why, I'm just around the corner on Wallace Street. I don't like my boarding house, though. It's bleak and lonesome, and my room looks out on such an unholy backyard. It's the ugliest place in the world. As for cats, well, surely all the Kingsport cats can't congregate there at night, but half of them must. I adore cats on hearth rugs, snoozing before nice friendly fires, but cats in backyards at midnight are totally different animals. The first night I was here, I cried all night, and so did the cats. You should have seen my nose in the morning. How I wished I had never left home.
I don't know how you managed to make up your mind to come to Redmond at all, if you're really such an undecided person,
said amused Priscilla.
Bless your heart, honey. I didn't. It was Father who wanted me to come here. His heart was set on it. Why, I don't know. It seems perfectly ridiculous to think of me studying for a B.A. degree, doesn't it? Not but what I can do it all right. I have heaps of brains.
Oh?
Said Priscilla vaguely.
Yes, but it's such hard work to use them. And B.A.s are such learned, dignified, wise, solemn creatures. They must be. No, I didn't want to come to Redmond. I did it just to oblige Father. He is such a duck. Besides, I knew if I stayed home I'd have to get married. Mother wanted that. Wanted it decidedly. Mother has plenty of decision. But I really hated the thought of being married for a few years yet. I want to have heaps of fun before I settle down. And, ridiculous as the idea of my being a B.A. is, the idea of my being an old married woman is still more absurd, isn't it? I'm only 18. No, I concluded I would rather come to Redmond than be married. Besides, how could I ever have made up my mind which man to marry?
Were there so many? Laughed Anne.
Heaps. The boys like me awfully. They really do. But there were only 2 that mattered. The rest were all too young and too poor. I must marry a rich man, you know.
Why must you?
Honey, you couldn't imagine me being a poor man's wife, could you? I can't do a single useful thing, and I am very extravagant. Oh no, my husband must have heaps of money. So that narrowed them down to 2. But I couldn't decide between 2 any easier than between 200. I knew perfectly well that whichever one I chose, I'd regret all my life that I hadn't married the other.
Didn't you love either of them? Asked Anne, a little hesitatingly. It was not easy for her to speak to a stranger of the great mystery and transformation of life.
Goodness, no. I couldn't love anybody. It isn't in me. Besides, I wouldn't want to. Being in love makes you a perfect slave, I think. And it would give a man such power to hurt you. I'd be afraid. No, no. Alec and Alonzo are 2 dear boys, and I like them both so much that I really don't know which I like the better. That is the trouble. Alec is the best looking, of course, and I simply couldn't marry a man who wasn't handsome. He is good-tempered, too, and has lovely curly black hair. He's rather too perfect. I don't believe I'd like a perfect husband. Somebody I could never find fault with.
Then why not marry Alonzo?
Asked Priscilla gravely.
Think of marrying a name like Alonzo,
said Phil dolefully.
I don't believe I could endure it. But he has a classic nose, and it would be a comfort to have a nose in the family that could be depended on. I can't depend on mine. So far, it takes after the Gordon pattern, but I'm so afraid it will develop Byrne tendencies as I grow older. I examine it every day anxiously to make sure it's still Gordon. Mother was a Byrne, and has the Byrne nose, in the Byrnest degree. Wait till you see it. I adore nice noses. Your nose is awfully nice, Anne Shirley. Alonzo's nose nearly turned the balance in his favor, but Alonzo! No, I couldn't decide. If I could have done as I did with the hats, stood them both up together, shut my eyes, and jabbed with a hat pin, it would have been quite easy.
What did Alec and Alonzo feel like when you came away?
Queried Priscilla.
Oh, they still have hope. I told them they'd have to wait till I could make up my mind. They're quite willing to wait. They both worship me, you know. Meanwhile, I intend to have a good time. I expect I shall have heaps of beaux at Redmond. I can't be happy unless I have, you know. But don't you think the freshmen are fearfully homely? I saw only one really handsome fellow among them. He went away before you came. I heard his chum call him Gilbert. His chum had eyes that stuck out that far. But you're not going yet, girls. Don't go yet."
"I think we must," said Anne, rather coldly. "It's getting late, and I've some work to do."
"But you'll both come to see me, won't you?"
asked Philippa, getting up and putting an arm around each.
"And let me come to see you. I want to be chummy with you. I've taken such a fancy to you both. And I haven't quite disgusted you with my frivolity, have I?"
"Not quite," laughed Anne, responding to Phil's squeeze with a return of cordiality.
"Because I'm not half so silly as I seem on the surface, you know. You just accept Philippa Gordon, as the Lord made her, with all her faults, and I believe you'll come to like her. Isn't this graveyard a sweet place? I'd love to be buried here. Here's a grave I didn't see before. This one in the iron railing. Oh, girls, look! See? The stone says it's the grave of a middy who was killed in the fight between the Shannon and the Chesapeake. Just fancy!"
Anne paused by the railing and looked at the worn stone, her pulses thrilling with sudden excitement. The old graveyard, with its overarching trees and long aisles of shadows, faded from her sight. Instead, she saw the Kingsport harbor of nearly a century agone. Out of the mist came slowly a great frigate, brilliant with the meteor flag of England. Behind her was another, with a still, heroic form, wrapped in his own starry flag, lying on the quarter-deck, the gallant Lawrence. Time's finger had turned back his pages, and that was the Shannon sailing triumphant up the bay with the Chesapeake as her prize.
"Come back, Anne Shirley! Come back!"
laughed Philippa, pulling her arm.
"You're 100 years away from us. Come back!"
Anne came back with a sigh. Her eyes were shining softly. "I've always loved that old story," she said, "and although the English won that victory, I think it was because of the brave, defeated commander I love it. This grave seems to bring it so near and make it so real. This poor little middy was only 18. He died of desperate wounds received in gallant action. So reads his epitaph. It is such as a soldier might wish for." Before she turned away, Anne unpinned the little cluster of purple pansies she wore, and dropped it softly on the grave of the boy who had perished in the great sea duel.
"Well, what do you think of our new friend?"
asked Priscilla when Phil had left them. "I like her. There is something very lovable about her, in spite of all her nonsense. I believe, as she says herself, that she isn't half as silly as she sounds. She's a dear, kissable baby, and I don't know that she'll ever really grow up."
"I like her too,"
said Priscilla decidedly.
"She talks as much about boys as Ruby Gillis does, but it always enrages or sickens me to hear Ruby, whereas I just wanted to laugh good-naturedly at Phil. Now, what is the why of that?"
"There is a difference," said Anne meditatively. "I think it's because Ruby is really so conscious of boys. She plays at love and love-making. Besides, you feel, when she is boasting of her beaux, that she is doing it to rub it well into you that you haven't half so many. Now, when Phil talks of her beaux, it sounds as if she was just speaking of chums. She really looks upon boys as good comrades, and she is pleased when she has dozens of them tagging round, simply because she likes to be popular and to be thought popular. Even Alex and Alonzo, I'll never be able to think of those two names separately after this, are to her just two playfellows who want her to play with them all their lives. I'm glad we met her, and I'm glad we went to Old St. John's. I believe I've put forth a tiny soul root into Kingsport soil this afternoon. I hope so. I hate to feel transplanted." End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 5. Letters from Home. For the next 3 weeks, Anne and Priscilla continued to feel as strangers in a strange land. Then, suddenly, everything seemed to fall into focus. Redmond, professors, classes, students, studies, social doings. Life became homogeneous again, instead of being made up of detached fragments. The freshmen, instead of being a collection of unrelated individuals, found themselves a class, with a class spirit, a class yell, class interests, class antipathies, and class ambitions. They won the day in the annual arts rush against the sophomores, and thereby gained the respect of all the classes, and an enormous, confidence-giving opinion of themselves. For 3 years the sophomores had won in the rush. That the victory of this year perched upon the freshmen's banner was attributed to the strategic generalship of Gilbert Blythe, who marshalled the campaign and originated certain new tactics, which demoralized the sophs and swept the freshmen to triumph. As a reward of merit, he was elected president of the freshman class, a position of honor and responsibility, from a fresh point of view at least, coveted by many. He was also invited to join the Lambs, Redmondese for Lambda Theta, a compliment rarely paid to a freshman. As a preparatory initiation ordeal, he had to parade the principal business streets of Kingsport for a whole day wearing a sunbonnet and a voluminous kitchen apron of gaudily flowered calico. This he did cheerfully, doffing his sunbonnet with courtly grace when he met ladies of his acquaintance. Charlie Sloane, who had not been asked to join the Lambs, told Anne he did not see how Blythe could do it, and he, for his part, could never humiliate himself so.
"Fancy Charlie Sloane in a calico apron and a sunbonnet,"
giggled Priscilla.
"He'd look exactly like his old grandmother Sloane. Gilbert, now, looked as much like a man in them as in his own proper habiliments."
Anne and Priscilla found themselves in the thick of the social life of Redmond. That this came about so speedily was due in great measure to Philippa Gordon. Philippa was the daughter of a rich and well-known man, and belonged to an old and exclusive Bluenose family. This, combined with her beauty and charm, a charm acknowledged by all who met her, promptly opened the gates of all cliques, clubs, and classes in Redmond to her, and where she went, Anne and Priscilla went too. Phil adored Anne and Priscilla, especially Anne. She was a loyal little soul, crystal-free from any form of snobbishness. "Love me, love my friends," seemed to be her unconscious motto. Without effort, she took them with her into her ever-widening circle of acquaintanceship, and the two Avonlea girls found their social pathway at Redmond made very easy and pleasant for them, to the envy and wonderment of the other freshettes, who, lacking Philippa's sponsorship, were doomed to remain rather on the fringe of things during their first college year. To Anne and Priscilla, with their more serious views of life, Phil remained the amusing, lovable baby she had seemed on their first meeting. Yet, as she said herself, she had heaps of brains. When or where she found time to study was a mystery, for she seemed always in demand for some kind of fun, and her home evenings were crowded with callers. She had all the beaux that heart could desire, for 9/10 of the freshmen and a big fraction of all the other classes were rivals for her smiles. She was naively delighted over this, and gleefully recounted each new conquest to Anne and Priscilla, with comments that might have made the unlucky lover's ears burn fiercely. "Alec and Alonzo don't seem to have any serious rival yet," remarked Anne teasingly.
"Not one,"
agreed Philippa.
"I write them both every week, and tell them all about my young men here. I'm sure it must amuse them. But, of course, the one I like best I can't get. Gilbert Blythe won't take any notice of me, except to look at me as if I were a nice little kitten he'd like to pat. Too well I know the reason. I owe you a grudge, Queen Anne. I really ought to hate you, and instead I love you madly, and I'm miserable if I don't see you every day. You're different from any girl I ever knew before. When you look at me in a certain way, I feel what an insignificant, frivolous little beast I am, and I long to be better and wiser and stronger. And then I make good resolutions. But the first nice-looking manny who comes my way knocks them all out of my head. Isn't college life magnificent? It's so funny to think I hated it that first day. But if I hadn't, I might never got really acquainted with you. Anne, please tell me over again that you like me a little bit. I yearn to hear it."
"I like you a big bit, and I think you're a dear, sweet, adorable, velvety, clawless little kitten," laughed Anne. "But I don't see when you ever get time to learn your lessons." Phil must have found time, for she held her own in every class of her year. Even the grumpy old professor of mathematics, who detested coeds, and had bitterly opposed their admission to Redmond, couldn't floor her. She led the freshettes everywhere, except in English, where Anne Shirley left her far behind. Anne herself found the studies of her freshman year very easy, thanks in great part to the steady work she and Gilbert had put in during those 2 past years in Avonlea. This left her more time for a social life which she thoroughly enjoyed. But never for a moment did she forget Avonlea and the friends there. To her, the happiest moments in each week were those in which letters came from home. It was not until she had got her first letters that she began to think she could ever like Kingsport or feel at home there. Before they came, Avonlea had seemed thousands of miles away. Those letters brought it near, and linked the old life to the new so closely that they began to seem one and the same, instead of 2 hopelessly segregated existences. The first batch contained 6 letters, from Jane Andrews, Ruby Gillis, Diana Barry, Marilla, Mrs. Lynde, and Davy. Jane's was a copperplate production, with every T nicely crossed and every I precisely dotted, and not an interesting sentence in it. She never mentioned the school, concerning which Anne was avid to hear. She never answered one of the questions Anne had asked in her letter. But she told Anne how many yards of lace she had recently crocheted, and the kind of weather they were having in Avonlea, and how she intended to have her new dress made, and the way she felt when her head ached. Ruby Gillis wrote a gushing epistle deploring Anne's absence, assuring her she was horribly missed in everything, asking what the Redmond "fellows" were like, and filling the rest with accounts of her own harrowing experiences with her numerous admirers. It was a silly, harmless letter, and Anne would have laughed over it had it not been for the postscript.
"Gilbert seems to be enjoying Redmond, judging from his letters,"
wrote Ruby.
"I don't think Charlie's as struck on it."
So Gilbert was writing to Ruby. Very well. He had a perfect right to, of course, only— Anne did not know that Ruby had written the first letter, and that Gilbert had answered it from mere courtesy. She tossed Ruby's letter aside contemptuously. But it took all Diana's breezy, newsy, delightful epistle to banish the sting of Ruby's postscript. Diana's letter contained a little too much Fred, but was otherwise crowded and crossed with items of interest, and Anne almost felt herself back in Avonlea while reading it. Marilla's was a rather prim and colourless epistle, severely innocent of gossip or emotion. Yet somehow it conveyed to Anne a whiff of the wholesome, simple life at Green Gables, with its savour of ancient peace, and the steadfast abiding love that was there for her. Mrs. Lynde's letter was full of church news. Having broken up housekeeping, Mrs. Lynde had more time than ever to devote to church affairs, and had flung herself into them heart and soul. She was at present much worked up over the poor "supplies" they were having in the vacant Avonlea pulpit.
"I don't believe any but fools enter the ministry nowadays,"
she wrote bitterly.
"Such candidates as they have sent us, and such stuff as they preach. Half of it ain't true, and what's worse, it ain't sound doctrine. The one we have now is the worst of the lot. He mostly takes a text and preaches about something else. And he says he doesn't believe all the heathen will be eternally lost. The idea! If they won't, all the money we've been giving to the foreign missions will be clean wasted, that's what. Last Sunday night he announced that the next Sunday he'd preach on the axe head that swam. I think he'd better confine himself to the Bible and leave sensational subjects alone. Things have come to a pretty pass if a minister can't find enough in Holy Writ to preach about, that's what. What church do you attend, Anne? I hope you go regularly. People are apt to get so careless about church going away from home, and I understand college students are great sinners in this respect. I'm told many of them actually study their lessons on Sunday. I hope you'll never sink that low, Anne. Remember how you were brought up, and be very careful what friends you make. You never know what sort of creatures are in them colleges. Outwardly they may be as whited sepulchres, and inwardly as ravening wolves, that's what. You'd better not have anything to say to any young man who isn't from the island. I forgot to tell you what happened the day the minister called here. It was the funniest thing I ever saw. I said to Marilla if Anne had been here, wouldn't she have laughed? Even Marilla laughed. You know he's a very short, fat little man with bow legs. Well, that old pig of Mr. Harrison's, the big, tall one, had wandered over here that day, again, and broke into the yard, and it got on the back porch, unbeknownst to us. And it was there when the minister appeared in the doorway. It made one wild bolt to get out, and there was nowhere to bolt except between them bow legs. So there it went, and being as it was so big and the minister so little, it took him clean off his feet and carried him away. His hat went one way and his cane another, just as Marilla and I got to the door. I'll never forget the look on him, and that poor pig was near scared to death. I'll never be able to read that account in the Bible of the swine that rushed madly down the steep place into the sea, without seeing Mr. Harrison's pig careening down the hill with that minister. I guess the pig thought he had the old boy on his back instead of inside of him. I was thankful the twins weren't about. It wouldn't have been a right thing for them to have seen a minister in such an undignified predicament. Just before they got to the brook, the minister jumped off or fell off. The pig rushed through the brook like mad and up through the woods. Marilla and I run down and helped the minister get up and brush his coat. He wasn't hurt, but he was mad. He seemed to hold Marilla and me responsible for it all, though we told him the pig didn't belong to us and had been pestering us all summer. Besides, what did he come to the back door for? You'd never have caught Mr. Allen doing that. It'll be a long time before we get a man like Mr. Allen. But it's an ill wind that blows no good. I've never seen hoof nor hair of that pig since, and it's my belief we never will. Things is pretty quiet in Avonlea. I don't find Green Gables as lonesome as I expected. I think I'll start another cotton warp quilt this winter. Mrs. Silas Sloane has a handsome new apple leaf pattern. When I feel that I must have some excitement, I'll read the murder trials in that Boston paper my niece sends me. I never used to do it, but they're real interesting. The States must be an awful place. I hope you'll never go there, Anne. But the way girls roam over the earth now is something terrible. It always makes me think of Satan in the book of Job, going to and fro and walking up and down. I don't believe the Lord ever intended it, that's what. Davy has been pretty good since you went away. One day he was bad, and Marilla punished him by making him wear Dora's apron all day. And then he went and cut all Dora's aprons up. I spanked him for that. And then he went and chased my rooster to death. The McPhersons have moved down to my place. She's a great housekeeper and very particular. She's rooted all my June lilies up, because she says that they make the garden look so untidy. Thomas set them lilies out when we were married. Her husband seems a nice sort of man, but she can't get over being an old maid, that's what. Don't study too hard, and be sure to put your winter underclothes on as soon as the weather gets cold. Marilla worries about you a lot, but I tell her you've got a lot more sense than I ever thought you would have at one time, and that you'll be all right.
Davy's letter plunged into a grievance at the start.
Dear Anne, please write and tell Marilla not to tie me to the rail of the bridge when I go fishing. The boys make fun of me when she does. It's awful lonesome here without you, but great fun in school. Jane Andrews is crosser than you. I scared Mrs. Lynde with a jack-o'-lantern last night. She was awful mad, and she was mad 'cause I chased her old rooster round the yard till he fell down dead. I didn't mean to make him fall down dead. What made him die, Anne? I want to know. Mrs. Lynde threw him into the pig pen. She might have sold him to Mr. Blair. Mr. Blair is giving 50 cents apiece for good dead roosters now. I heard Mrs. Lynde asking the minister to pray for her. What did she do that was so bad, Anne? I want to know. I've got a kite with a magnificent tail, Anne. Milty Boulter told me a great story in school yesterday. It is true. Old Joe Mosey and Leon were playing cards one night last week in the woods. The cards were on a stump, and a big black man bigger than the trees came along and grabbed the cards and the stump and disappeared with a noise like thunder. I'll bet they were scared. Milty says the black man was the old Harry. Was he, Anne? I want to know. Mr. Kimball over at Spencervale is very sick and will have to go to the hospitable. Please excuse me while I ask Marilla if that's spelled right. Marilla says it's the 'sylum he has to go to, not the other place. He thinks he has a snake inside of him. What's it like to have a snake inside of you, Anne? I want to know. Mrs. Lawrence Bell is sick, too. Mrs. Lynde says that all that is the matter with her is that she thinks too much about her insides."
"I wonder," said Anne, as she folded up her letters, "what Mrs. Lynde would think of Philippa." End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 6. In the Park.
"What are you going to do with yourselves today, girls?"
asked Philippa, popping into Anne's room one Saturday afternoon. "We are going for a walk in the park," answered Anne. "I ought to stay in and finish my blouse, but I couldn't sew on a day like this. There's something in the air that gets into my blood and makes a sort of glory in my soul. My fingers would twitch and I'd sew a crooked seam. So it's ho for the park in the pines."
Does "we" include anyone but yourself and Priscilla?
"Yes, it includes Gilbert and Charlie, and we'll be very glad if it will include you also,"
But
said Philippa dolefully.
if I go, I'll have to be Gooseberry, and that will be a new experience for Philippa Gordon.
"Well, new experiences are broadening. Come along and you'll be able to sympathize with all poor souls who have to play gooseberry often. But where are all the victims?"
Oh, I was tired of them all, and simply couldn't be bothered with any of them today. Besides, I've been feeling a little blue. Just a pale, elusive azure. It isn't serious enough for anything darker. I wrote Alec and Alonzo last week. I put the letters into envelopes and addressed them, but I didn't seal them up. That evening something funny happened. That is, Alec would think it funny, but Alonzo wouldn't be likely to. I was in a hurry, so I snatched Alec's letter, as I thought, out of the envelope and scribbled down a postscript. Then I mailed both letters. I got Alonzo's reply this morning. Girls, I had put that postscript to his letter, and he was furious. Of course he'll get over it, and I don't care if he doesn't, but it spoiled my day. So I thought I'd come to you darlings to get cheered up. After the football season opens, I won't have any spare Saturday afternoons. I adore football. I've got the most gorgeous cap and sweater, striped in Redmond colors, to wear to the games. To be sure, a little way off, I'll look like a walking barber's pole. Do you know that Gilbert of yours has been elected captain of the freshman football team?
"Yes, he told us so last evening,"
said Priscilla, seeing that outraged Anne would not answer.
"He and Charlie were down. We knew they were coming, so we painstakingly put out of sight or out of reach all Miss Ada's cushions. That very elaborate one with the raised embroidery I dropped on the floor in the corner behind the chair it was on. I thought it would be safe there, but would you believe it? Charlie Sloane made for that chair, noticed the cushion behind it, solemnly fished it up, and sat on it the whole evening. Such a wreck of a cushion as it was! Poor Miss Ada asked me today, still smiling, but oh so reproachfully, why I had allowed it to be sat upon. I told her I hadn't, that it was a matter of predestination coupled with inveterate Sloanishness, and I wasn't a match for both combined.
"Miss Ada's cushions are really getting on my nerves," said Anne. "She finished 2 new ones last week, stuffed and embroidered within an inch of their lives. There being absolutely no other cushionless place to put them, she stood them up against the wall on the stair landing. They topple over half the time, and if we come up or down the stairs in the dark, we fall over them. Last Sunday, when Dr. Davis prayed for all those exposed to the perils of the sea, I added in thought, 'And for all those who live in houses where cushions are loved not wisely but too well.' There, we're ready, and I see the boys coming through Old St. John's. Do you cast in your lot with us, Phil?"
I'll go, if I can walk with Priscilla and Charlie. That will be a bearable degree of gooseberry. That Gilbert of yours is a darling, Anne. But why does he go around so much with goggle eyes?"
Anne stiffened. She had no great liking for Charlie Sloane, but he was of Avonlea, so no outsider had any business to laugh at him. "Charlie and Gilbert have always been friends," she said coldly. "Charlie is a nice boy. He's not to blame for his eyes."
"Don't tell me that. He is. He must have done something dreadful in a previous existence to be punished with such eyes. Pris and I are going to have such sport with him this afternoon. We'll make fun of him to his face, and he'll never know it."
Doubtless, the abandoned peas, as Anne called them, did carry out their amiable intentions. But Sloane was blissfully ignorant. He thought he was quite a fine fellow to be walking with two such co-eds, especially Philippa Gordon, the class beauty and belle. It must surely impress Anne. She would see that some people appreciated him at his real value. Gilbert and Anne loitered a little behind the others, enjoying the calm, still beauty of the autumn afternoon under the pines of the park, on the road that climbed and twisted round the harbour shore. "The silence here is like a prayer, isn't it?" said Anne, her face upturned to the shining sky. "How I love the pines! They seem to strike their roots deep into the romance of all the ages. It is so comforting to creep away now and then for a good talk with them. I always feel so happy out here."
And so in mountain solitudes o'ertaken as by some spell divine, their cares drop from them like the needles shaken from out the gusty pine,
quoted Gilbert.
They make our little ambitions seem rather petty, don't they, Anne?
"I think, if ever any great sorrow came to me, I would come to the pines for comfort," said Anne dreamily.
I hope no great sorrow ever will come to you, Anne,
said Gilbert, who could not connect the idea of sorrow with the vivid, joyous creature beside him, unwitting that those who can soar to the highest heights can also plunge to the deepest depths, and that the natures which enjoy most keenly are those which also suffer most sharply. "But there must, sometime," mused Anne. "Life seems like a cup of glory held to my lips just now, but there must be some bitterness in it. There is in every cup. I shall taste mine some day. Well, I hope I shall be strong and brave to meet it, and I hope it won't be through my own fault that it will come. Do you remember what Dr. Davis said last Sunday evening? That the sorrows God sent us brought comfort and strength with them, while the sorrows we brought on ourselves, through folly or wickedness, were by far the hardest to bear. But we mustn't talk of sorrow on an afternoon like this. It's meant for the sheer joy of living, isn't it?"
If I had my way, I'd shut everything out of your life but happiness and pleasure, Anne,
said Gilbert in the tone that meant danger ahead. "Then you would be very unwise," rejoined Anne hastily. "I'm sure no life can be properly developed and rounded out without some trial and sorrow, though I suppose it is only when we are pretty comfortable that we admit it. Come, the others have got to the pavilion and are beckoning to us." They all sat down in the little pavilion to watch an autumn sunset of deep red fire and pallid gold. To their left lay Kingsport, its roofs and spires dim in their shroud of violet smoke. To their right lay the harbour, taking on tints of rose and copper as it stretched out into the sunset. Before them the water shimmered, satin smooth and silver grey, and beyond, clean-shaven William's Island loomed out of the mist, guarding the town like a sturdy bulldog. Its lighthouse beacon flared through the mist like a baleful star, and was answered by another in the far horizon.
"Did you ever see such a strong-looking place?"
asked Philippa.
"I don't want William's Island especially, but I'm sure I couldn't get it if I did. Look at that sentry on the summit of the fort, right beside the flag. Doesn't he look as if he had stepped out of a romance?"
Speaking of romance,
said Priscilla.
"We've been looking for heather, but of course we couldn't find any. It's too late in the season, I suppose."
"Heather?" exclaimed Anne. "Heather doesn't grow in America, does it?"
"There are just 2 patches of it in the whole continent,"
said Phil.
"One right here in the park, and one somewhere else in Nova Scotia, I forget where. The famous Highland regiment, the Black Watch, camped here one year, and when the men shook out the straw of their beds in the spring, some seeds of heather took root."
"Oh, how delightful!" said enchanted Anne.
Let's go home around by Spofford Avenue.
Suggested Gilbert.
We can see all the handsome houses where the wealthy nobles dwell. Spofford Avenue is the finest residential street in Kingsport. Nobody can build on it unless he's a millionaire.
"Oh, do,"
said Phil.
"There's a perfectly killing little place I want to show you, Anne. It wasn't built by a millionaire. It's the first place after you leave the park, and must have grown while Spofford Avenue was still a country road. It did grow. It wasn't built. I don't care for the houses on the avenue. They're too brand new and plate glassy. But this little spot is a dream, and its name... But wait till you see it."
They saw it as they walked up the pine-fringed hill from the park. Just on the crest, where Spofford Avenue petered out into a plain road, was a little white frame house with groups of pines on either side of it, stretching their arms protectingly over its low roof. It was covered with red and gold vines, through which its green-shuttered windows peeped. Before it was a tiny garden, surrounded by a low stone wall. October though it was, the garden was still very sweet, with dear old-fashioned, unworldly flowers and shrubs. Sweet may, southernwood, lemon verbena, alyssum, petunias, marigolds, and chrysanthemums. A tiny brick wall, in herringbone pattern, led from the gate to the front porch. The whole place might have been transplanted from some remote country village, yet there was something about it that made its nearest neighbor, the big lawn-encircled palace of a tobacco king, look exceedingly crude and showy and ill-bred by contrast. As Phil said, it was the difference between being born and being made. "It's the dearest place I ever saw," said Anne delightedly. "It gives me one of my old, delightful, funny aches. It's dearer and quainter than even Miss Lavendar's stone house."
It's the name I want you to notice especially,
said Phil.
"Look, in white letters, around the archway over the gate. Patty's Place. Isn't that killing? Especially on this avenue of Pinehurst and Elmwolds and Cedarcrofts. Patty's Place, if you please. I adore it."
Have you any idea who Patty is?
asked Priscilla.
Patty Spofford is the name of the old lady who owns it, I've discovered. She lives there with her niece, and they've lived there for hundreds of years, more or less. Maybe a little less, Anne. Exaggeration is merely a flight of poetic fancy. I understand that wealthy folk have tried to buy the lot time and again. It's really worth a small fortune now, you know. But Patty won't sell upon any consideration. And there's an apple orchard behind the house, in place of a backyard. You'll see it when we get a little past. A real apple orchard on Spofford Avenue.
"I'm going to dream about Patty's Place tonight," said Anne. "Why, I feel as if I belonged to it. I wonder if, by any chance, we'll ever see the inside of it,"
It isn't likely,
said Priscilla. Anne smiled mysteriously. "No, it isn't likely, but I believe it will happen. I have a queer, creepy, crawly feeling, you can call it a presentiment if you like, that Patty's Place and I are going to be better acquainted yet." End of chapter 6.